From the scorching heat of the African sun to the suffocating darkness of the slave ships that crossed the Atlantic, there exists a story that America spent centuries trying to bury, a story of a young warrior, a son, a dreamer, snatched from his homeland, and thrown into a world designed to break him. His name was Kunta Kinte, and in chains he carried the fire of an entire generation. What happened to him was not just a tragedy, it was a testimony of how far a human being can be pushed, and how unshakable the will to remain human can be. Before he became a symbol, he was a boy running barefoot through the rich red soil of Jufureh, a village in the Gambia where honor, pride, and ancestry meant everything. He had never imagined that this soil, his soil, would be the last thing he touched freely. His life would be rewritten by force, his identity beaten, stripped, and renamed by men who believed they could erase a lineage with whips, chains, and fear. But America was wrong. This is the story they never wanted told. A story that exposes the brutal machinery of slavery, the resilience of a young African taken far from home, and the truth behind a name that refused to die. Because Kunta Kinte was more than a slave. He was a survivor, a rebel, a memory that lived on when entire systems crumbled. And to this day his name echoes louder than the men who tried to silence it. This is not just history. This is a wound, a legacy, and a truth waiting to be confronted. Kunta Kinte's early life in Jufureh was shaped by a world rich in culture, tradition, and a deep sense of belonging that threaded every part of daily life. Born into the Mandinka people, he grew up surrounded by rhythms of drums, scent of cooking fires, and the unspoken codes of honor that guided the fabric of his community. The land itself played a defining role in who he became, from the warm red soil that stained the soles of his feet, to the winding Gambia River that carried stories from distant villages. As a child, he absorbed the wisdom of elders who recited genealogies that stretched back centuries, teaching him that a man who knew his ancestors knew himself. These lessons weren't mere words but a framework for life, shaping his understanding of duty, respect, courage, and the weight of carrying a family name. From the earliest years, Kunta was taught to see the world through the Mandinka lens of purpose and responsibility. Boys in Jufureh learned early that bravery wasn't measured by the absence of fear but by the willingness to face it. His father, Omoro Kinte, was a man of dignity and discipline, and Kunta admired him deeply. His mother, Benta, held the household together with quiet strength, her presence grounding the family with warmth and wisdom. In this environment he developed not only a strong physical frame, but a sharp mind shaped by curiosity and a desire to understand the world beyond the village boundary. Daily life was filled with tasks that prepared him for adulthood, tending to goats, gathering firewood, learning the rituals of the farming season, and observing the village's intricate social order. The cultural rituals around him reinforced a sense of identity that would become the foundation of his resilience later in life. The Mandinka way of life celebrated community above all, where no child truly belonged only to one family but to the entire village. Children grew up under the shared guidance of relatives, neighbors, elders, and spiritual keepers. When the drums sounded in the evening, signaling gatherings or celebrations, Kunta watched dancers move in patterns passed down through generations, each movement telling stories of battles, love, harvests, and ancestral victory. These dances were not just entertainment but living archives of memory, reminding people of who they were and where they came from. Education in Jufureh was a blend of practical living and oral tradition. Kunta learned to read the sky for signs of weather changes, to recognize animal tracks in the forest, and to understand the seasons of planting and harvest. At the same time, he listened to griots, storytellers who carried the village's history in their voices, narrate the tales of kings, warriors, and the long lineage of the Kinte family. These stories instilled a sense of pride and continuity, and he internalized the belief that every Kinte carried a legacy of strength, discipline, and honor, and that his actions must reflect the dignity of his ancestors. As he grew older, Kunta entered the stage of adolescence marked by rites of passage that transformed boys into men. These rites were sacred, involving tests of endurance, discipline, and reflection. Young men learned to hunt, to defend themselves, and to navigate the complexities of tribal responsibility. For Kunta, this period was a revelation, awakening in him a deeper understanding of what it meant to protect one's community and uphold one's heritage. He began to see himself as part of a larger chain, each link representing those who came before and those who would come after. The elders emphasized that a man's character was his most valuable possession, and Kunta embraced this belief wholeheartedly. Life in Jufureh was not without its dangers or challenges, but it was a world governed by order and mutual respect. Kunta grew up witnessing the harmony between nature and human life, learning that every tree, river, and animal carried spiritual significance. The village held ceremonies to honor the spirits of the land, seeking guidance and protection. These spiritual practices shaped Kunta's understanding of his place in the universe, reinforcing the idea that he was connected to forces much greater than himself. The prayers spoken at dawn, the offerings given during harvest season, and the chants recited during community gatherings taught him humility and reverence. Friendships formed an essential part of his youth, giving him companions with whom he shared laughter, mischief, and dreams. Together they raced through the fields, climbed trees and tested their bravery in the forests, near the village. These relationships strengthened his sense of solidarity and loyalty, values that would later guide his resistance against oppression. Among his peers, Kunta was known for his keen observation and quick reflexes, traits that made him excel during training sessions. His teachers often said that he possessed the spirit of a leader, someone who would one day bring honor to the Kinte name. The bond between Kunta and his family was perhaps the strongest influence on his early life. He revered his father's calm authority and his mother's nurturing guidance. Their teachings shaped his moral compass, instilling in him the belief that truth and integrity were non-negotiable virtues. His father taught him the importance of standing firm, never bowing to shame or dishonor, while his mother's stories of their ancestors reassured him that courage flowed naturally in his veins. Through them, he learned that identity was something sacred, something that no one had the right to take away. As he approached manhood, Kunta began to explore more distant parts of the land, driven by youthful curiosity and a growing sense of independence. These journeys introduced him to traders, travelers, and neighboring tribes, broadening his understanding of the world beyond Jaffa. He learned about cultures different from his own, dialects he had never heard, and customs that fascinated him. These encounters nurtured a desire to travel farther, to see lands beyond the familiar riverbanks and forests. Yet no matter where he wandered, he always returned home with a renewed appreciation for the stability and warmth of his village. The village elders saw promise in him, and often reminded him that knowledge and discipline would determine the kind of man he would become. They emphasized that being Mendinka was not just a matter of birth, but a responsibility carried with honor. Kunta internalized these teachings, forming a strong sense of self rooted in his culture, beliefs and tradition. This identity would later become the core that the brutal system of slavery tried and failed to erase. The strength of Kunta's early life lay in its harmony, structure, and deep cultural pride. Every lesson he learned, every memory he formed, and every experience he lived became part of the armor that would later protect him. The laughter of his childhood, the discipline of his training, the stories of his ancestors, the warmth of his mother's voice, the steady guidance of his fathers, the brotherhood of his peers, and the spiritual rituals of his people, all contributed to a foundation that shaped him into a young man with an unbreakable sense of identity. It was this foundation that would ignite his resistance when he was thrust into the unimaginable darkness of captivity. And it was this foundation that America never understood, or accounted for when they attempted to strip him of his name, his heritage, and his humanity. The brutal kidnapping and the tragic Middle Passage began not as a single moment of violence, but as a creeping presence that moved through West Africa like a shadow long before it reached Kunta. Stories had circulated in neighboring villages about strange men lurking near forests, about people disappearing while fetching water, and about white-skinned intruders who seized the young and strong. But in Jaffa, these tales felt distant, like echoes carried by the wind from lands too far away to pose an immediate threat. Life moved forward with its familiar rhythms, and although the elders warned the youth to be cautious, no one imagined how close danger had already come. For Kunta, who had stepped fully into his adolescence with confidence and dreams of future adventures, the world still felt safe enough to explore. It was during one of these explorations that his life was violently torn off its path. The day began like any other, with the sun rising over the Gambia River and casting warm light across the landscape. Kunta had set out to gather firewood, carrying with him the easy sense of independence that came with near manhood. The forest paths were familiar to him, dotted with trees he had climbed as a child and streams he had splashed through during playful hunts with friends. But hidden within those woods, watching and waiting, were the slave catchers, men armed with nets, weapons, and a ruthless resolve born from greed. They knew the terrain well enough, having hunted human beings across it for years. They moved silently, leaving no trace except the quiet terror that followed in their wake. Kunta first sensed something was wrong when the forest fell too silent. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. He tightened his grip on the firewood, but continued walking, unaware that he was already in the hunter's sight. The attack came suddenly, violently, and with precision. A rope yanked his feet from beneath him, and before he could regain balance, hands seized. He fought with every ounce of strength that ran through his blood, clawing at the earth, twisting his body, shouting with a voice that could shake the trees. But the men were prepared. His resistance only fueled their brutality. A blow struck his head, another his back, and in moments he was immobilized, bound like an animal and dragged away from the world he had known since birth. The confusion and the pain blurred together. He tried to scream again, but a gag was forced into his mouth. His wrists burned against the ropes. His chest heaved with desperation. The last images he saw of his homeland were the tops of the trees swaying above him, and patches of sky slipping behind dense foliage as he was carried deeper into captivity. Every sound, distant drums, rustling leaves, the snap of branches felt like a farewell he had no power to answer. For the first time in his life, Kunta felt helpless, and the terror of not knowing whether he would ever see his family again overwhelmed him. He was taken to a slave barracoon, a coastal holding pen where captured Africans were imprisoned before being sold to European traders. The barracoon was a place thick with despair. Men, women, and children lay bound and wounded, their eyes hollow, their bodies bearing marks of torture and exhaustion. The air was filled with a mix of sweat, blood, and fear so strong it clung to the skin like humidity. Kunta was thrown among them, and as he regained consciousness, he realized the magnitude of the nightmare he had been forced into. These were not criminals or enemies of war. These were ordinary people stolen from their homes just like him. No rhythm of drums reached this place. No familiar voices called his name. No elders stood to offer guidance. It was as though he had been ripped out of existence and placed into a world where humanity itself was a crime. Days passed with little food, less water, and no comfort. Every attempt to escape was met with violence. The captives whispered about what awaited them, stories of giant wooden ships and unknown lands, places where the sun did not rise on freedom. Some refused to believe such places existed, insisting that death would come first. Others silently prayed, hoping their spirits would guide them back home even if their bodies could not. Kunta listened, absorbing every fragment of information, refusing to let despair take root in him. But even he could not suppress the dread that tightened around his chest each time the European traders arrived to inspect the captives, as though they were livestock. When the day came for their transfer to the ship, chaos erupted. People screamed, resisted, begged, and fought until they were beaten into submission. Kunta felt the rough hands shove him forward, forcing him toward the shoreline. When he saw the ship for the first time, towering above the water like a monstrous creation, his heart thundered. The ship was massive, built not for exploration but for imprisonment. It carried the scent of death, even before he stepped onto it. Its wooden frame seemed to pulse with the suffering of those who had been carried across the ocean before him. The slave catchers herded the captives up the plank, their whips cracking against skin, their voices rising with cruel authority. Below deck, the conditions were worse than any nightmare. The space was cramped, dark, and suffocating. People were chained together in pairs or groups, forced to lie shoulder to shoulder in spaces so tight that movement was almost impossible. The air was thick with heat and rot, and there was no escape from the stench of sweat, urine, vomit, and blood. Kunta was chained by the ankles, the iron biting into his skin, and pressed against strangers who trembled with fear. The only light seeped through the cracks in the wooden hull, offering faint glimpses of the horror surrounding them. The middle passage was not a journey but a prolonged assault on the body and spirit. Each day brought new pain. Those who cried were beaten. Those who fought were whipped. Those who grew too weak were thrown overboard like discarded cargo. Diseases spread rapidly, and the screams of the sick often blended with the sound of waves crashing against the ship. Kunta's world shrank to darkness, agony, and the faint hope that he might somehow live long enough to find a way home. He held on to memories of Jufur, his mother's smile, his father's voice, the feel of warm soil beneath his feet, using them as a shield against the brutality that threatened to swallow him whole. Sometimes during moments when the ship rocked violently, he imagined the ocean itself trying to break the vessel apart to free the captives and return them to their homeland. But the ocean, like everything else in this new world, offered no mercy. The men guarding the ship were ruthless, enforcing control through violence. They forced the captives onto the deck at intervals to exercise them, which was nothing more than another excuse for beating. Kunta watched men collapse under exhaustion, women dragged away for abuse, and children crying until their voices faded into silence. Yet even in the depths of this suffering, the captives found ways to cling to fragments of their humanity. They whispered prayers in their native languages, hummed broken rhythms that echoed their homelands, and comforted one another in small, fragile gestures of solidarity. Kunta listened to these whispered traditions and held on to them with all his strength. They reminded him that he was still Mandinka, still a son of Jufur, still Kunta Kinte. They reminded him that no matter what awaited him at the end of the voyage, the essence of who he was could not be erased by chains, dark.
or the cruelty of men who believed they owned him. The middle passage stretched on, an endless cycle of suffering and survival, a journey designed to break the body and spirit. But through every lash, every sickness, every moment of hopelessness, Kunta endured with the resilience that had been woven into him since childhood. And as the ship pushed forward across the vast Atlantic, each wave carried him farther from his homeland, while pushing him toward a fate America never meant for the world to fully understand. The first moments on American soil and the dehumanizing slave markets began with a disorienting blur of light, noise, and a smell that was unfamiliar yet equally suffocating as the stench of the ship's hold. When the slaves were finally ordered above deck, the sunlight hit Kunta Kinte with a force that felt almost violent after weeks of darkness. His eyes burned, his skin cracked from salt and sweat, and his legs felt unsteady from being chained in cramped positions for so long. Yet even in this disheveled state, he sensed immediately that whatever awaited them on this new land was built on cruelty. The ship docked at a port bustling with activity, but not the kind of life he knew. This was commerce, noise, and the movement of men whose expressions carried greed rather than community. The unfamiliar language shouted across wooden planks, the clatter of tools, the harsh bark of orders, all of it blended into a chaotic world designed to intimidate and overwhelm freshly stolen Africans. As Kunta and the others were herded down the gangplank, the reality of their situation became even more horrifying. The men guarding them moved with calculated aggression, striking anyone who hesitated, ensuring that fear kept the line moving. For Kunta, each step was an agony of confusion and anger, his gaze darting to the strange buildings, the towering ships, and the faces of people who stared at them with curiosity or disdain. Some spectators pointed, whispering among themselves as though observing livestock arriving for trade. Others laughed or spat, making it clear that these newly arrived captives were not being seen as human beings. Kunta could feel the weight of those eyes, each one stripping away the dignity and identity he had fought to hold onto during the middle passage. The captives were marched into a holding pen, a crude enclosure made of wooden planks and dirt, where they were left under guard. The sun beat down on them mercilessly, and thirst clawed at their throats, yet no relief was offered. This place was a temporary cage before the true horror began. The auction. Slave markets were constructed with the purpose of breaking the spirit before the sale. The captives were not given time to recover from the voyage. Their weakened bodies paraded immediately to emphasize control and dependency. Traders moved between them, poking and prodding, lifting limbs, inspecting teeth, and speaking in harsh tones as they evaluated each captive's potential value. To them, strength meant profit, youth meant longevity, and compliance meant ease of ownership. Kunta watched these men with a mixture of rage and bewilderment. He had never seen a world where people were priced like goods, where their skills, strength, and even scars were listed like features of an animal. Women were inspected with a degrading intimacy that sparked screams and sobs. Children cried for parents they had lost during the voyage, or in the chaos of capture. The sounds filled the enclosure with a grief so dense it felt suffocating. Kunta stood among them, his body chained, his spirit pulled in different directions. Resistance on one side, despair on the other. He replayed memories of Jufur in his mind as a desperate anchor, reminding himself that he was Mendinka, that he belonged to a lineage too proud to bow easily. As the hours passed, the preparations for the auction became more evident. Large wooden platforms were set up, and buyers began to gather, dressed in fine clothes and speaking in loud voices dripping with entitlement. They carried ledgers, coins, and whips, the tools of men who believed they had the right to own another human being. One trader, tall and imposing, entered the pen with a bucket of water. For a moment, hope flickered among the captives, but it was quickly extinguished when the man threw the water on them, not to offer relief but to clean their skin for display. The cold splash was meant to make them appear healthier than they were, to give buyers the illusion of vitality. When Kunta's group was called to the platform, the guards dragged them up by force. The crowd pressed closer, examining the captives with calculating. The auctioneer's voice boomed, describing each person in terms of labor, strength, and obedience. Kunta felt the rope tighten around him as he was pulled forward. His body was still sore, but he lifted his chin, refusing to let them see. The auctioneer grabbed his jaw, forcing his mouth open, showing his teeth to the crowd as though he were a beast. Hands touched his arms, his back, his legs, analyzing musculature, checking for injuries, evaluating whether he would survive years of labor in the field. The humiliation burned through him, and his heart pounded with a fury he could barely contain. The auction was a spectacle of cruelty. Buyers shouted bids, raising their voices over one another to purchase the strongest captive. Families who had survived the ship together were torn apart with no regard for their screams or pleas. A mother clung to her daughter until a guard ripped them apart, dragging the child one direction, and the mother another. Kunta watched it happen, his stomach twisting with helpless anger. He wanted to fight, to break the chains, to strike out at the men responsible, but he knew resistance in this moment would only result in punishment or death. Every survivor of the Middle Passage understood the terrible truth. The body belonged to the buyer, but the mind was still theirs to protect if they could. When Kunta's turn came to be sold, the bidding started immediately. His youth, his strong build, and the fire still evident in his eyes made him desirable to slave owners seeking long-term labor. The crowd murmured at his defiant posture, some impressed, others suspicious. A wealthy plantation owner stepped forward, placing a high bid, and in moments the transaction was complete. Just like that, with a gesture and a price, Kunta Kinte became legally bound to a life of enslavement in a foreign land. The rope was pulled, and he was led away from the platform, away from the other captives, and deeper into an existence engineered to break him. But even in this moment, something inside him refused to bend. He replayed the teachings of his father, the songs of his mother, the wisdom of the elder. He reminded himself silently who he was, even as strangers shouted orders he could not yet understand. Each step he took across the dusty ground of the slave market carved a deeper wound into his identity, but it also carved a vow they could control his body, but his spirit, his name, his sense of self, would not be surrendered easily. Behind him, the chaos of the auction continued, with more lives being bought and sold, more chains being fastened, more histories being erased in the eyes of the men who believed ownership replaced humanity. As he was transported away from the market, the landscape of America unfolded before him: wide fields, towering trees, and settlements that seemed both impressive and menacing. This was the world he had been forced into, a world that treated him not as Kunta Kinte, son of Omoro born of the Mandinka people, but as property. Yet even in the midst of this dehumanizing nightmare, the memory of who he truly was burned with fierce determination, refusing to be silenced by the cruelty that surrounded him.
The relentless attempts to break Kunta Kinte's identity through forced renaming began almost immediately after he was sold to a plantation owner. The very first moment he arrived at the plantation, the concept of being called anything other than his birth name was thrust upon him with deliberate cruelty. The men who held authority over him spoke in a language he could barely understand, their words sharp and commanding. "Toby," one of them barked, as if by saying it enough times the name would stick. Kunta froze, recognizing the effort to erase not just his identity but the lineage, the culture, and the very essence of who he was. His name was sacred, a gift from his ancestors, a chain of memory stretching back centuries, yet the white men treated it like a trivial label easily discarded. The first lesson came quickly: resistance had consequences. When Kunta refused to answer to the new name, the overseer's patience dissolved into violence. Whips cracked across the air, cutting through the still morning as a warning to him and any others who might question authority. Kunta's back bore the sting of each blow, his body writhing in pain, but his mind clung stubbornly to the identity he had been given at birth. He refused to let a name forced upon him by strangers erase the boy who had run barefoot through the fields of Jofere, who had listened to his father's wisdom, who had sung the songs of his ancestors. Every lash was designed to break him, yet every lash strengthened the resolve that the chains could not touch. Over time, the efforts to strip Kunta of his identity grew more systematic. He was subjected to relentless drills meant to teach obedience, rising before dawn, performing repetitive labor under the watchful eyes of overseers, repeating the name Toby whenever addressed, and being punished if he faltered. The plantation sought to replace his heritage with submission, and they used every tool at their disposal: fear, exhaustion, hunger, and humiliation. Kunta learned quickly that defiance came with consequences. Yet even in the depths of forced compliance he cultivated a quiet rebellion in his heart. He would say the name Toby when forced, but in his mind and soul he remained Kunta Kinte. The psychological assault extended beyond the physical. Every aspect of the plantation was designed to undermine the captive's sense of self. The enslaved were isolated from any remnants of their culture. Language, music, and rituals from their homelands were forbidden or discouraged. Kunta was surrounded by people speaking broken dialects, some clinging to fragments of African traditions, others gradually adopting the white master's ways. This cultural disconnection was deliberate. The slave owners understood that an individual with a strong sense of heritage was harder to control. Kunta Kinte, however, resisted in subtle ways. He whispered Mandinka words to himself, hummed the tunes he remembered, and shared small pieces of his culture with those he trusted. These small acts were dangerous but necessary. They were lifelines to his identity. The plantation's authorities also used comparison and manipulation as tools to erode his sense of self. They pointed out those who had accepted their new names, framing them as examples of submission that led to better treatment. Rewards, privileges, or slightly lighter labor were dangled like bait, all designed to make Kunta question whether holding on to his real name was worth the pain. Yet he observed these transactions carefully, noting that those who surrendered too much seemed to lose more than they gained. Submission might offer temporary relief, but it came at the cost of the very essence who one was. This understanding strengthened his resolve. Even as his body was subjected to the endless demands of the plantation, Kunta also had to navigate the social pressures among the enslaved people themselves. Some believed that survival meant adopting the new names, blending in and avoiding confrontation at all costs. Others quietly rebelled in small ways, preserving memory through song, language, and storytelling. Kunta found allies among the latter, men and women who also refused to let their identities be erased. Together they shared stories of their homelands, recited family names, and clung to rituals that reminded them of who they were. This camaraderie was fragile but powerful, a reminder that resistance was not solely an individual battle but a shared effort to maintain dignity against the machinery of slavery. The struggle to retain his identity was complicated further by the relentless physical labor imposed upon him. Fields stretched endlessly under the hot sun, demanding strength and endurance that tested every fiber of his being. Overseers monitored every movement, every misstep punished without hesitation. The work was designed to exhaust, to leave no room for thought beyond survival, and yet Kunta found ways to anchor himself in memory. When planting or harvesting, he visualized the fields of Jofre, the forests and rivers, the village paths he had once known. These mental journeys provided a shield against the dehumanization surrounding him. Even as his body bent to the whip, his mind refused to bend to the will of men who did not know the weight of heritage. The naming struggle also involved subtle acts of defiance that were inherently dangerous. When forced to write or respond to his new name, Kunta would sometimes hesitate, mispronounce it deliberately, or even speak softly in Mandinka under his breath. These small acts were risky because overseers were quick to punish any perceived insubordination, but they were crucial to maintaining his sense of self. Every whispered word, every small rebellion, was a thread connecting him to the boy who had lived free, who had run through the red soil of his homeland with pride and confidence. The danger made it sacred, a ritual of resistance against the constant pressure to conform. Even the environment around the plantation tried to reinforce submission. Signs, fences, and punishments created a world where the new name was omnipresent. The name Toby was written, spoken, and shouted, used to control, demean, and reduce Kunta to a label devoid of history or meaning. Yet the human spirit proved resilient. Kunta Kinte's mind continued to resist. In moments of solitude, when others slept, when the sun set, when the fields lay empty, he would repeat his real name silently, affirming his lineage, his heritage, and his identity. He reminded himself that no whip, no shouted order, no system of oppression could claim the truth of who he was. His identity was not a possession to be taken. It was a force embedded in memory, blood, and spirit. The attempts to erase Kunta's identity stretched beyond words and labored to psychological games meant to instill hopeless. Overseers mocked his refusal to submit, calling him stubborn, defiant, or foolish. They hoped that ridicule would weaken his resolve, that constant belittlement would eventually convince him that his real name was meaningless. Yet every insult, every demonstration of power, only reinforced his determination. He clung to the names of his ancestors, the rituals he had known, and the memories of Jofre. In this way, the assault on his identity, relentless, violent, and calculated, failed to extinguish the core of who Kunta Kinte was. Through these relentless attempts, Kunta Kinte developed a profound understanding of the nature of power and resistance. He learned that the physical control over the body was only one aspect of domination, and that maintaining a sense of self required vigilance, courage, and strategy. Every day brought new challenges, new punishments, and new opportunities for his identity to be tested. Yet he endured, not through surrender, but through a quiet, unwavering insistence on being Kunta Kinte, son of Omoro, heir to a lineage that could not be rewritten by chains, whips, or the cruel intent of men who sought to reduce him to property. Kunta Kinte's resistance, punishment, and unbroken spirit became defining elements of his life on the plantation, shaping him into a figure of quiet defiance that both terrified and fascinated those around him. From the moment he arrived, he understood that survival required more than mere obedience. It demanded a delicate balance between outward compliance and inward rebellion. Kunta had seen what blind submission could do to the enslaved, how quickly one could be broken in body, mind, and spirit, and he resolved that he would never surrender the essence of who he was. His spirit, forged in the fires of his upbringing in Jofre,
became a shield against the relentless pressures of a system designed to crush identity and autonomy. Resistance began in small, subtle ways. When overseers demanded that he perform tasks in a particular way, Kunta sometimes delayed, moved slowly, or made minor mistakes that could not be entirely punished without drawing attention. He learned to use these small acts strategically, asserting control over his own body even under the constant gaze of authority. Each act, no matter how minor, was a reminder to himself that he retained a fragment of freedom, a part of him that could not be taken no matter how severe the punishment. To the enslavers, such behaviors were infuriating and incomprehensible. To Kunta they were essential exercises of self-preservation. The punishments he endured were severe, calibrated to break both body and will. Whippings left deep, lasting scars, bruises that faded slowly but remained as permanent reminders of the cruelty inflicted upon him. Forced labor in the fields, often from dawn until dusk, sapped energy, while scarcity of food and the constant threat of violence created a climate of exhaustion that wore down many. Overseers thrived on fear, using Kunta's defiance as an example to intimidate others. Yet, with every strike of the whip, every harsh word, every attempt to bend him, Kunta's resolve deepened. He realized that endurance was not just physical, it was a conscious daily choice to retain his identity, his dignity and his humanity. Kunta's spirit, manifested most visibly in his refusal to adopt the name Toby, which his captors imposed on him. The insistence that he answer to this name was not merely symbolic, it was a methodical attack on his sense of self. The more he resisted, the harsher the punishment, yet he clung to his real name with an almost sacred devotion. To the enslavers this stubbornness was irrational and dangerous. To Kunta it was essential. His name connected him to his father, his mother, his ancestors, and the soil of Jofre. Each time he repeated it silently, each time he corrected someone who mispronounced it, he reinforced the invisible chain of memory that slavery could never sever. Beyond resisting names, Kunta's defiance extended to subtle acts of independence in the work he was forced to perform. He maintained a sense of rhythm and method in his labor that allowed him to survive while minimizing mistakes that could draw harsher punishment. At times he would take moments to observe his surroundings, noting escape routes, potential allies and the movements of overseers. While outwardly compliant, his mind was active, assessing, planning and preserving strategies that could one day lead to freedom or at least personal dignity. This mental resilience was critical in an environment designed to reduce thought to simple obedience. The community of enslaved people around him played a crucial role in sustaining Kunta's spirit. Though the plantation sought to isolate individuals, whispers of resistance traveled between quarters, and shared stories of homeland and heritage created pockets of psychological refuge. Kunta learned from others, taught others, and together they maintained fragments of culture that slavery sought to erase. These connections reminded him that his struggle was part of a larger human effort, that resisting the erasure of identity was a communal act as much as an individual one. Even under surveillance, these bonds provided a lifeline, a sense of solidarity that strengthened his resolve against relentless oppression. Punishments also became a site of defiance. Kunta endured pain with a composed face, refusing to cry out or beg in a manner that would satisfy the overseer. He understood that emotional submission was a tool of control, a method to degrade the spirit, and he consciously rejected it. By facing punishment without yielding internally, he preserved a measure of authority over himself that no whip or harsh word could claim. This composure inspired awe and fear among both enslaved peers and captors alike, demonstrating that spirit could remain unbroken even when the body was battered. Kunta's resistance was not without moments of intense fear and doubt. There were nights when the weight of hopelessness pressed down, when the brutality seemed insurmountable, and when the thought of enduring the rest of his life in bondage threatened to extinguish hope. Yet even in these moments, he found ways to anchor himself. He recalled lessons from his father about honor and courage, stories of ancestors who had endured and prevailed, and the deep rhythms of Mandinka life that had shaped his early years. These memories became a source of inner strength, a reminder that his spirit was larger than the plantation, and the men who sought to dominate him. The unbroken spirit of Kunta Kinte also manifested in acts of verbal resistance. When circumstances allowed, he refused to speak in a way that fully conformed to the language and terms imposed on him, often inserting words from Mandinka, correcting overseers, or speaking with a tone that subtly asserted his autonomy. These small acts carried enormous personal risk, but they were necessary to maintain his mental and emotional independence. In a world where everything was intended to erase him, these tiny verbal assertions became powerful symbols of selfhood. Over time, Kunta's consistent resistance shaped not only his own survival but also the perceptions of those around him. He became a figure both feared and respected, a symbol that even in the brutal controlling environment of the plantation, a human being could resist the totalizing force of slavery. His defiance became a quiet but undeniable statement that oppression, no matter how methodical or violent, could never fully extinguish identity, pride and willpower. Each act, whether small or overt, was a reaffirmation of the unbreakable link between his body, his mind and his heritage. Kunta Kinte's endurance and spirit also highlight the broader truth of human resilience in the face of unimaginable cruelty. Every lash, every insult, every attempt to erase his identity tested him, yet each trial reinforced his commitment to himself and to the memory of his homeland. His resistance was not flamboyant or reckless, it was deliberate, measured and rooted in a deep understanding of the stake. He knew that survival required patience, that spirit required vigilance, and that the preservation of identity required courage that transcended immediate pain. Through every day of labor, every punishment, and every encounter with cruelty, Kunta Kinte remained steadfast, a living testament to the power of resilience, the endurance of the human spirit, and the unyielding refusal to surrender one's true self to the machinery of oppression. Life on the plantation, and the everyday horrors of slavery defined the world Kunta Kinte was forced into, a world that was meticulously structured to dominate, dehumanize and erase individuality. From the moment he stepped onto the soil of the plantation, he was thrust into a system that measured every movement, every action, every breath with the unrelenting logic of control. The land itself seemed to conspire with cruelty. Fields stretched endlessly under the scorching sun, barns and quarters confined captives to spaces where privacy was non-existent, and overseers' eyes were ever present, watching for the slightest hint of disobedience. Each day was a relentless cycle of labor, surveillance and punishment, designed to grind both body and spirit into submission. Yet Kunta's mind remained anchored to memory, identity and a fierce will to survive. The day began before sunrise, with the shrill sound of a horn or bell signaling the captives to rise. The air was often thick with fog or dust, the ground cold or wet beneath bare feet, yet the enslaved were forced to move quickly, assembling in lines while overseers barked orders with impatient cruelty. Kunta, despite the exhaustion from the middle passage, and the punishments he had already endured, learned to navigate these routines with caution and strategy. The work itself was grueling, clearing fields, planting crops, tending livestock and harvesting under the unrelenting sun. Every task demanded physical strength, endurance, and a relentless pace that left little time for thought beyond survival. Yet even in this harsh environment, Kunta retained a sense of self that the system could not erase. The plantation was a world of rigid hierarchies, where authority was maintained through fear and violence. Overseers wielded whips and rods, enforcing obedience with precision and cruelty. Mistakes, delays or even perceived disrespect were punished swiftly. The enslaved learned to anticipate the moods of those in power, to calculate movements and words carefully, and to hide acts of subtle resistance. Kunta's resistance was often silent, manifesting in the smallest gestures, a hesitation, a carefully measured step, a refusal to adopt the name Toby. These acts were dangerous, yet they were essential in preserving a sense of autonomy, even in a place designed to strip it away. Hunger and scarcity were constant companions. The rations provided were insufficient for the physical demands placed upon the enslaved. Meals consisted of minimal portions of cornmeal, sometimes supplemented with watery soups or scraps, leaving many weak and vulnerable to disease. Kunta learned to endure the pangs of hunger, often rationing food carefully or sharing it quietly with others when possible. Starvation was another tool of control, used to remind the enslaved of their dependence and vulnerability. Despite these hardships, Kunta drew strength from his memories of Jafara, visualizing the abundance of his homeland, and the meals he had shared with family as a form of mental sustenance. The quarters where the enslaved slept were cramped, overcrowded and unsanitary. Wooden huts were shared by multiple individuals, often without bedding, ventilation or privacy. Illness spread rapidly, and medical care was minimal or non-existent. In these conditions, Kunta learned to care for himself and others, understanding that survival required attention to both body and mind. Nights were fraught with the tension of potential punishment or escape attempt. Overseers patrolled even in darkness, and any noise or suspected planning could result in immediate retribution. Yet in these small spaces, Kunta and others shared whispers, stories and memories of Africa, maintaining a fragile but vital connection to identity and heritage. Violence was a constant reality, not limited to physical punishment alone. The psychological torment was as relentless as the whippings and beatings. Enslaved people were often forced to witness cruelty against others, creating an environment of fear and despair. Families were torn apart at the whim of owners, husbands separated from wives, children from parents, all under the justification of property rights. Kunta witnessed these atrocities and absorbed the lessons they carried, that resistance carried risk, that compliance could buy temporary relief, and that survival required both caution and courage. The horrors of the plantation were designed to crush spirit, yet they also highlighted the importance of inner resilience and solidarity among the enslaved. Despite the brutality, Kunta found ways to navigate this world with intelligence and observation. He learned the rhythms of the overseers, the patterns of the work and the subtle cues that indicated danger. These skills allowed him to minimize punishment and preserve energy for moments of quiet defiance or reflection. He observed the interactions among enslaved people, learning who could be trusted, who might share knowledge or aid, and who might betray for self-preservation. This acute awareness was critical in maintaining both safety and a sense of agency in a world where autonomy was systematically stripped away. Religion and spiritual practices offered another layer of resistance and solace. While slaveholders often attempted to impose Christianity, many enslaved people retained aspects of African spiritual traditions, blending them with new practices to create forms of hope and psychological resilience. Kunta participated in secret gatherings, shared songs and prayers that invoked ancestors, and held on to rituals that reminded him of home. These acts, though dangerous if discovered, reinforced a sense of continuity and identity, acting as an invisible thread connecting him to a world the plantation sought to erase. Kunta's labor was relentless, yet it also became a training ground for mental toughness. Fields were vast, tools were heavy, and the pace was exhausting, but he learned to endure, to anticipate threats, and to find small moments of control within the larger machinery of oppression. He understood the necessity of balancing outward compliance with inner defiance. While the enslavers sought total domination, they could not control thought, memory, or spirit entirely, and Kunta's survival depended on exploiting that small but crucial space of freedom. Relationships among the enslaved were critical for psychological survival. Bonds of friendship, kinship, and solidarity formed networks of support in a hostile environment. Kunta engaged in these networks cautiously, sharing knowledge, warnings, and encouragement. He witnessed acts of bravery, selflessness, and resistance among his peers, which inspired him to maintain his own resolve. The community provided both practical and emotional support, offering lessons in survival and reminders that even in captivity, humanity and loyalty could persist. The daily horrors of plantation life also included forced participation in systems that dehumanized others. Kunta was compelled to witness, and sometimes participate in, the control and punishment of fellow captives. These moments tested his moral compass and self-control, forcing him to navigate ethical dilemmas. In a world where compassion could invite punishment, he learned to act with discretion, to protect himself while maintaining a sense of integrity and humanity whenever possible. Each decision, each careful choice became a testament to his resilience and strategic thinking. Through the endless cycle of labor, punishment, hunger, and surveillance, Kunta Kinte's spirit remained unbroken. The plantation sought to reduce him to a body, a tool, a commodity, yet he preserved a mental space where he remained son of Omoro, born of the Mandinka people, heir to a legacy that no whip or master could erase. Every day, as he labored under the scorching sun, as he endured beatings and verbal abuse, as he witnessed the suffering of others, he also remembered his identity, his homeland, and the resilience that had been instilled in him since childhood. In the midst of unimaginable cruelty, Kunta Kinte became a living testament to the endurance of human dignity and the capacity of the spirit to resist the machinery of oppression.
The psychological war between enslaved Africans and their slave masters was an invisible battlefield that raged every day on plantations, shaping the lives of men, women, and children. Like Kunta Kinte, unlike the physical punishments and labor that were openly brutal, this war attacked the mind, aiming to break identity, instill fear, and erase any sense of personal autonomy. The slave owners understood that control over the body was not enough to fully dominate. They needed to colonize the mind to convince the enslaved that their worth, heritage, and dignity were null, that their names, languages, and traditions were irrelevant in the new world. Kunta quickly realized that survival required navigating both the tangible threats of whips and chains and the intangible pressures of mental subjugation. From the very beginning, Kunta was confronted with a system designed to manipulate perception. Slave masters employed fear as a constant, omnipresent tool. The crack of a whip, the sharp bark of orders, the threat of separation from family. All were reminders that resistance carried dire consequences. Every action was scrutinized and every misstep punished. Yet the war was not solely external. It seeped into the consciousness of the enslaved, creating confusion, self-doubt, and internalized oppression. Kunta observed those around him who had succumbed to this psychological manipulation, hearing them speak in the names imposed upon them, seeing them obey without question. These examples were meant to pressure him into submission, to convince him that resistance was futile, and that compliance was the only path to survival. Kunta, however, understood that this manipulation was only effective if he allowed it to define him. The mental strategy of his captors relied on eroding memory and identity, on convincing him that his past, his lineage and his cultural heritage were meaningless in the new world. Names, songs, languages and stories were systematically suppressed. When Kunta refused to answer to the name Toby, the overseers responded with ridicule and physical punishment, attempting to demonstrate that individuality was a liability. Every act of psychological control was calculated to make him doubt himself, to strip away his prize, and to make the enslaved entirely dependent on the authority of their captors. The plantation also employed tactics that exploited social dynamics among the enslaved. Those who submitted, who obeyed without question, were often given slightly better treatment, while defiance was punished visibly to set examples. This created tension, suspicion, and sometimes betrayal among people who had been allies in Africa. Kunta witnessed friends and acquaintances compromise their own principles in order to survive, and he understood the delicate balance required to navigate these relationships. Trust had to be earned carefully, and solidarity had to be maintained cautiously to avoid attracting the attention of overseers. This constant negotiation of social and psychological pressures was exhausting, yet it was necessary for both safety and the preservation of self. The mental warfare extended to the exploitation of fear and hope simultaneously. Overseers and owners manipulated the enslaved by alternating between cruelty and fleeting kindness. A kind word, a small allowance or an opportunity for rest could be offered and then taken away abruptly, conditioning the enslaved to anticipate punishment and to internalize guilt or inadequacy for perceived failures. Kunta quickly recognized these patterns, understanding that the manipulation was deliberate. The moments of leniency were not genuine acts of compassion, but tools designed to reinforce the perception of power and to maintain psychological dominance. The enslaved were made to feel perpetually vulnerable, and any small act of independence became an act of defiance against a system that sought to own not just their bodies but their minds. Isolation was another critical weapon in the psychological arsenal of slavery. Families were split apart, children were separated from parents, and social networks that might offer support or solidarity were disrupted. Kunta, like many others, experienced the deep emotional impact of this forced separation. The loss of familial connection was intended to undermine resilience, making each enslaved person feel alone, powerless, and dependent on the slaveholder. Yet even in isolation, Kunta's memories of Jafar, of his parents, and of the songs and stories of his people became mental fortresses. The psychological war was fought in the space between the body and the mind, and in this space Kunta's internal resistance became as critical as his outward defiance. Language itself was weaponized. The imposition of English, the prohibition of African dialects, and the enforcement of new names were strategies designed to sever cultural continuity. By controlling the words the enslaved could speak, the masters sought to control thought, belief, and self-perception. Kunta responded by internalizing his mother tongue, teaching fragments of it to others secretly, and maintaining the memory of his lineage through repetition and prayer. Each whispered word, each mental rehearsal of stories and songs, was an act of resistance, a refusal to let psychological warfare extinguish the continuity of his identity. Language became both a battleground and a lifeline. Fear was compounded by the constant threat of physical violence. The mind quickly associated defiance with pain, creating an internalized obedience even before the whip struck. Kunta's captors relied on this instinctive conditioning, knowing that anticipation of punishment could control behavior as effectively as punishment itself. Yet Kunta learned to master his reactions, to steel his mind against anticipatory terror, and to separate the inevitability of suffering from the inviolability of his inner self. The mind, he realized, could be a refuge even when the body was under siege, and cultivating mental resilience was essential to surviving the psychological onslaught of slavery. The psychological war also manifested through manipulation of hope and despair. Promises of freedom, inheritance, or reward were dangled before the enslaved to inspire compliance, while false assurances and broken promises reinforced hopelessness. Kunta recognized the deceit, understanding that hope could be weaponized as easily as he learned to cultivate hope internally, rooted not in the gestures or words of his captors but in memories of home, identity, and the knowledge that his spirit remained beyond the reach of chains. This inner hope became a shield against despair, a quiet resistance that could not be observed, punished, or removed. Religion and forced indoctrination were also central to the psychological war. Slaveholders used Christianity as a tool to justify domination, encouraging beliefs that the enslaved were sinful, inferior, and destined to obey. Kunta, however, interpreted these teachings through his own lens, filtering them with memories of Mandinka spirituality and the moral framework instilled by his parents. He found ways to reconcile imposed doctrine with personal belief, resisting the psychological subjugation that aimed to replace his moral and spiritual compass. Faith, memory and internalized cultural knowledge became weapons against the subtle tyranny of mental manipulation. Ultimately, the psychological war was relentless and pervasive. Kunta Kinte was forced to endure constant surveillance, verbal abuse, physical punishment and cultural erasure, all designed to break the mind and force submission. Yet through awareness, memory, discipline and subtle acts of defiance, he maintained a sense of self that slavery could not conquer. The struggle was continuous, exhausting and fraught with danger, but it forged a resilience that was invisible to his captors yet unbreakable. Kunta's ability to preserve his identity, to resist internalizing oppression, and to maintain the memory of his heritage stands as a testament to the power of the human spirit, even in the darkest circumstances of bondage. Kunta Kinte's attempts to escape and the consequences he faced became defining moments in his life as an enslaved African, illustrating both the fierce desire for freedom and the relentless oppression that sought to extinguish it. From the first day he set foot on the plantation, the idea of escape was both terrifying and intoxicating. He had been torn from the red soil of Jaforo, from the familiar rhythms of his village, and from the protection of his family. Every day under the lash and the unyielding supervision of overseers reminded him of the cruelty of his captivity, but also of the possibility of reclaiming autonomy. The thought of fleeing became a constant presence in his mind, a silent companion that fueled his endurance even as it carried immense risk. The first attempts at escape were often exploratory, testing the boundaries of the plantation's surveillance and the behavior of the guard. Kunta observed patterns, when overseers changed shifts, when certain paths were lightly guarded, and when natural elements like darkness or fog could provide cover. Planning an escape was not merely physical, it required acute awareness, patience and mental calculation. Each step had to be considered, from the direction to take to the tools or resources needed, and above all, the possibility of encountering betrayal from fellow captives or local informants. Kunta understood that a failed attempt could result in brutal punishment, even death. Yet the desire to return to freedom and homeland overpowered the fear compelling him to try. The first attempt at running was marked by a mixture of adrenaline, fear, and exhilaration. Kunta waited for the cover of night, moving quietly through the quarters while the overseers' patrols passed by. His body, though weakened from labor and malnourishment, moved with agility, guided by memories of the terrain in Africa, and instincts honed in youth. He imagined the open forests, the rivers, and the sounds of his village guiding him. But the escape was quickly thwarted when a plantation dog barked, and the crack of a whip echoed through the night. Kunta was seized, his body beaten, and chains were tight. This first failure was a harsh lesson in the limits imposed by his captors, but it did not extinguish his resolve. The consequences of attempting escape were deliberately public, designed to instill terror in the hearts of others. Kunta was bound and displayed before the other enslaved people, whipped until his flesh was raw, and made to witness the punishments of those who had tried before him. These rituals of punishment were both physical and psychological warfare. They demonstrated the reach and power of the overseers, reinforcing the notion that freedom was a luxury beyond reach. Yet for Kunta, the cruelty only deepened the fire within him. He understood that these consequences were intended to erase hope, to force obedience, but he refused to let fear dominate his spirit. Over time, Kunta learned that escape required more than courage. It demanded strategy, alliances and knowledge. He listened carefully to the stories of others who had survived attempts, noting the mistakes and successes that had occurred. He gathered intelligence about the surrounding lands, rivers and settlements, trying to piece together routes that might lead him to freedom. He considered the risks of capture, the possibility of betrayal, and the limitations imposed by his physical condition. Every detail mattered because failure was not merely a setback, it was potentially fatal. Kunta's mind became a laboratory for planning and problem-solving, a quiet space where freedom was imagined even when the body was chained. The physical landscape of the plantation and surrounding areas presented its own challenge. Fields stretched for miles under the hot sun, forests were patrolled, and nearby settlements were populated by people loyal to the system of slavery. Waterways could be both refuge and trap, rivers offered concealment, but also the risk of drowning. Kunta had to navigate these dangers mentally and physically, imagining every step, every obstacle, and every contingency. The plantation itself was a prison with invisible walls, constructed not only from fences and overseers, but from the fear of the unknown and the consequences of failure. Escape was not just an act, it was a mental exercise in courage, calculation and determination. Kunta's second attempt at flight was more calculated,
Informed by previous failure and careful observation, he chose a night when the wind masked his movements and the overseers were distracted by other labor or punishment duties. Moving silently, he tried to follow a path along the edges of the plantation, avoiding patrols, and for a moment it seemed that he might succeed, that the freedom he craved was within reach. But fate, in the form of a small mistake, or an unseen observer, intervened. Kunta was caught again, and this time the punishment was more severe. He was chained for extended periods, and the whippings were deliberately harsher, leaving scars that would serve as permanent reminders of the cost of defiance. The plantation authorities escalated their efforts after repeated attempts. Kunta was subjected to tighter supervision, his movements constantly monitored, and any hint of disobedience met with immediate reprisal. He was moved between quarters, isolated from those who had previously offered guidance or support, and forced to perform grueling tasks under direct observation. This strategy was designed to erode both the physical capacity and the mental will to resist. Yet Kunta's mind remained a fortress. He continued to rehearse escape routes, to dream of freedom, and to remind himself of the identity he had fought to preserve. Each day of labor, punishment, and surveillance became both a test of endurance and a rehearsal for the possibility of eventual liberation. Kunta's repeated attempts at escape also had social implications. The overseers and owners used him as an example to instill fear in others, emphasizing the futility of resistance. Yet his defiance also inspired those around him. Enslaved people observed his courage, his refusal to submit mentally or spiritually, and many drew strength from his example. He became a symbol of resistance, a reminder that even in the most oppressive conditions, the desire for freedom could not be extinguished. Kunta's struggles demonstrated that rebellion was not only a physical act, but a mental and moral statement, a refusal to surrender to the totalizing control of slavery. In addition to physical punishment, the psychological impact of failed escapes was immense. Kunta had to confront despair, the terror of permanent injury or death, and the possibility of losing hope. He wrestled with questions about the limits of his endurance, the reliability of allies, and the feasibility of freedom in a world designed to prevent. Yet even in moments of despair, he drew strength from memory, the sights, sounds, and teachings of Jufuri, the songs and stories of his people, and the knowledge that his identity could not be erased by chains or punishment. Each attempt, each failure, became a reaffirmation of his commitment to resist, to survive, and to maintain the spirit of freedom within. Ultimately, Kunta Kinte's escape attempts highlight the relentless tension between oppression and the human desire for freedom. They reveal the courage required to defy a system designed to annihilate autonomy, the mental and physical resilience necessary to endure punishment, and the indomitable power of hope in the face of cruelty. His story demonstrates that even when the body is constrained, the spirit can remain free, and that acts of defiance, no matter how dangerous, are essential expressions of humanity and dignity in a world intent on denying both the bonds of family, community, and cultural memory. Became the lifelines that sustained Kunta Kinte through the relentless brutality of slavery, shaping his resistance and helping him preserve the identity that his captors sought to erase. From the moment he was torn from Jufuri, he carried the echoes of home songs, stories, traditions, and the names of ancestors that had been passed down through generations. These were not trivial memories. They were the foundation of his sense of self, the invisible armor that protected him from the psychological and physical assaults of the plantation. Every act of labor, every punishment endured, every command obeyed outwardly was balanced by an inward devotion to remembering who he was, where he came from, and the legacy he was determined to uphold. Family was the first and most potent link to identity. Though physically separated from his parents and siblings, Kunta constantly recalled the lessons and values instilled in him by Omoro and his mother. The discipline, courage, and moral guidance he had absorbed in childhood became internal standards against which he measured every action. In moments of extreme stress or exhaustion, he would draw on these memories, silently repeating the words of his father or recalling the comforting rituals of his village. This inner dialogue became a lifeline, a source of strength that allowed him to endure punishment without succumbing to despair. The memory of family was not only emotional sustenance but also a moral compass, guiding him in how to act with dignity and resilience despite the dehumanizing conditions around him. Beyond his immediate family, the larger community of enslaved Africans offered both practical support and cultural continuity. In the quarters and fields, small networks formed based on trust, shared origin, or common experiences. These relationships allowed for the discreet transmission of African traditions, languages, and stories. Kunta participated in these exchanges, teaching younger or newer captives the songs and phrases he remembered, learning from others who preserved fragments of homeland culture, and observing subtle acts of rebellion that conveyed lessons of survival and resistance. The community became a buffer against total isolation, creating a psychological space where the enslaved could maintain a sense of humanity, continuity and shared purpose. Storytelling was one of the most powerful tools for preserving memory and culture. Around fires or in the quiet moments before dawn, Kunta and others recounted tales of their ancestors, of heroes who had resisted oppression and of the landscapes they had left behind. These narratives were not just entertainment, they were acts of resistance, preserving knowledge and identity against the systematic erasure imposed by slaveholders. Kunta internalized these stories, using them to strengthen his resolve and to maintain a mental connection to Juf. The act of remembering and retelling reinforced a sense of belonging, reminding him that he was part of a lineage and culture that transcended the physical confines of the plantation. Music and song were equally critical in maintaining community and spirit. Rhythms and melodies carried encoded histories, moral lessons and emotional expression that could not be fully understood or controlled by slaveholders. Kunta learned and participated in these musical traditions, sometimes subtly, sometimes more openly when the overseers were absent or distracted. Songs of sorrow, hope and resilience provided emotional release, reinforced collective identity and transmitted memory across generations. They were a way to assert humanity and cultural continuity in an environment designed to deny both. The bonds of community also extended to acts of mutual protection and care. Kunta observed and participated in the ways enslaved people supported one another in the face of punishment, illness, or hunger. Simple gestures, sharing food, offering a comforting word, helping each other with labor, became acts of quiet defiance and expressions of solidarity. These networks mitigated the isolation imposed by slaveholders, and reinforced the principle that survival depended not only on individual endurance but also on collective strength. Kunta learned that while the plantation sought to divide and control, the human instinct for empathy and cooperation could persist even in extreme conditions. Kunta's interactions with other enslaved people also served as a training ground for understanding human behavior under oppression. He observed who could be trusted, who might betray, and who had the courage or cunning to maintain dignity in small ways. These observations informed his decisions, whether in choosing confidants, planning subtle acts of defiance, or maintaining mental independence. Community provided a mirror in which he could see both the possibilities and the dangers of resistance, reinforcing the importance of alliances, observation and strategy in navigating the oppressive system. The preservation of language was another critical element of community and cultural memory. While overseers imposed English names and forbade African dialects, Kunta and others continued to speak fragments of their mother tongues, secretly, passing knowledge to those who had not yet been captured as a form of resistance. Language became a private sanctuary, a repository of identity and a tool to communicate complex ideas and shared memories in ways that slaveholders could not fully control. Through language, Kunta reinforced connections to homeland, culture and ancestry, strengthening both his individual resolve and the cohesion of the community. Rituals, whether religious or cultural, also maintained continuity and provided psychological resilience. Enslaved Africans adapted traditional practices to the conditions of the plantation, holding secret gatherings, offering prayers and observing commemorations that reinforced identity. Kunta participated in these rituals as a means of mental and spiritual sustenance, finding in them the strength to endure and the affirmation that the plantation could not fully dominate his inner life. The collective observance of rituals fostered a sense of belonging and continuity, demonstrating that culture and memory could survive even in captivity. The bonds of family, community and culture also influenced Kunta's approach to resistance. He learned that defiance was not only an individual act but a shared responsibility, reinforced and sustained by the knowledge that others were watching, learning and supporting one another. Every act of courage, every refusal to accept a false identity, every whispered story or song was amplified through the communal network, reinforcing the idea that resistance could persist despite overwhelming odds. The collective memory of the enslaved became both a shield and a weapon, fortifying Kunta's resolve and providing a framework for enduring the daily realities of slavery. Even in the face of punishment, forced labor and surveillance, the bonds of community allowed Kunta to maintain a sense of continuity and identity. They reminded him that he was not merely a captive but a custodian of culture, memory and legacy. The reinforcement of African values, language and stories, provided the mental and emotional resources necessary to resist total subjugation. Each interaction, each act of teaching or sharing, each communal song or story became an affirmation of life and humanity in a world designed to suppress both. Through these networks, Kunta Kinte's sense of self remained intact. The memory of home, the teachings of family, the support of peers, and the continuity of culture allowed him to endure unimaginable hardships. They provided the foundation upon which he could resist the physical and psychological violence of the plantation, preserving his identity and dignity. Kunta's story demonstrates that even in the most oppressive circumstances, the bonds of family, community and culture can sustain the spirit, reinforce resistance, and ensure that heritage and memory persist across generations. These connections also shaped his future interactions and the way he would continue to navigate a life of bondage. They reminded him that survival was not solely about enduring labor or punishment, but about sustaining the mind, the spirit, and the links to a past that no master could erase. Kunta's life illustrates that even in captivity, humans find ways to preserve identity, to nurture resilience, and to maintain the threads of memory that anchor them to who they are and where they come from.
The relentless oppression of slavery, the harsh labor and the constant threat of violence shaped Kunta Kinte's life, but it was his internal struggle, his fight to preserve his identity and humanity, that defined the essence of his existence on the plantation. Kunta's story is not only one of physical endurance but of mental fortitude, a testament to the ways in which a human being can resist erasure even under extreme circumstances. Every day on the plantation was a test of strength, of cunning, of memory, and of spirit. The conditions were designed to break him completely, from the grueling fieldwork that began at dawn and ended at dusk, to the scant rations meant to sap his energy, to the pervasive atmosphere of fear and surveillance that ensured he was never truly at ease. Yet within this system of total control, Kunta nurtured an internal resistance that slavery could not touch. From the very first day he understood that survival required careful navigation between outward compliance and inner defiance. The overseers and owners demanded obedience not only in action but in thought and speech, attempting to strip the enslaved of their names, language, and heritage. Kunta resisted in subtle yet profound ways. He refused to answer to the name Toby, maintaining his connection to his father, his village, and his ancestors. He repeated his Mandinka prayers quietly, hummed the songs of his homeland under his breath, and taught fragments of his culture to trusted companions. These acts, while small in appearance, were monumental in their significance, serving as affirmations of selfhood and continuity in a system designed to eradicate both. The physical punishments were brutal and relentless. Whippings left scars across his back that would never fully fade, and beatings were often designed not just to cause pain but to humiliate and instill fear. Kunta's body bore the evidence of cruelty, yet his spirit remained untouchable. He learned to endure suffering with a disciplined mind, separating pain from identity. While the plantation sought to reduce him to a mere tool for labor, Kunta cultivated a mental space where he remained Kunta Kinte, son of Omoro, heir to a proud lineage. This dual existence, submitting outwardly while preserving inner freedom, was a daily exercise in resilience and strategy. Labor itself was a form of both oppression and inadvertent empowerment. The fields were vast, and the work unending, yet in the repetition of planting, tending, and harvesting, Kunta found moments to observe, reflect, and plan. He studied the rhythms of the overseers, the timing of patrols, the vulnerabilities of the plantation's layout. Each task, while physically taxing, became an opportunity to maintain situational awareness, to cultivate patience, and to preserve hope. Endurance was not merely about survival, it was about keeping the mind active, alert, and resilient in the face of relentless control. Kunta's identity was continuously challenged by the social dynamics of the enslaved community. Some embraced their new identities or adapted quickly to the plantation system, seeking favor or lessening punishment through compliance. Others resisted quietly, sharing knowledge, culture, and strategies for survival. Kunta carefully navigated these networks, learning whom to trust, whom to guide, and whom to observe. The social bonds among the enslaved became a crucial source of strength, offering companionship, wisdom, and solidarity in a world designed to isolate individuals. Each interaction was measured, balancing the risk of exposure with the need for connection and the preservation of identity. Memory became one of Kunta's most powerful tools. He drew upon vivid recollections of Jafar, the forests, rivers, and villages of his youth, the teachings of his parents, and the songs and rituals of his people. These mental images were more than nostalgia. They were a form of resistance. By maintaining a detailed mental map of his homeland, he refused to allow the plantation to define his world entirely. Memory anchored him to an identity that no whip, no chains, and no harsh word could erase. It provided emotional sustenance during moments of despair and reinforced the moral framework and courage instilled by his upbringing. Language and cultural preservation were also central to his resistance. The plantation sought to erase African dialects, replacing them with English and imposing new names. Kunta countered this through secret instruction, discreet communication and the internal recitation of Mandinka words and phrases. These linguistic acts were invisible to the overseers but crucial for maintaining continuity of thought, memory and identity. Language became both shield and weapon, a subtle assertion of autonomy in a world intent on domination. The psychological warfare employed by the enslavers was relentless. Fear, uncertainty and manipulation were used to control every aspect of life, from the timing of meals and rest, to the allocation of work and punishment. Kunta observed and adapted to these tactics, developing mental strategies to preserve his composure and focus. He learned to anticipate the moods of overseers, to calculate risk, and to maintain an internal equilibrium that allowed him to endure what would otherwise have been overwhelming. Psychological resilience became as vital as physical strength, and Kunta honed it with the same care he applied to survival in the fields. Kunta's attempts to escape, though met with harsh punishment, exemplified his unwavering commitment to freedom. Each effort was carefully planned, informed by observation and intelligence, and executed with a mixture of courage and caution. The failures were brutal, yet they reinforced lessons in strategy, patience and resilience. Punishment for escape attempts was not merely physical, it was psychological, a warning to others and a test of Kunta's spirit. Yet even in the face of repeated failure, he refused to let captivity extinguish the desire for autonomy, demonstrating a remarkable balance of hope, prudence and defiance. Community and cultural networks sustained Kunta through these trials. The shared knowledge, mutual support and preservation of African traditions provided both practical and emotional lifelines. Elders, peers and trusted allies became sources of guidance, encouragement and solidarity. Through these connections, Kunta was reminded that his struggle was part of a larger human endeavor to resist dehumanization and maintain dignity. The bonds of community reinforced his understanding that survival was not only about individual endurance, but about sustaining collective memory and identity. Religious and spiritual practices played a similarly crucial role. While the plantation imposed Christian doctrine, Kunta blended these teachings with African beliefs and rituals, creating a personal framework that fortified his mental and spiritual resilience. Prayer, reflection and secret observances became acts of quiet defiance, asserting that the spirit could remain free even when the body was confined. These practices reinforced moral grounding, provided comfort and strengthened the psychological fortitude needed to endure the systemic cruelty of slavery. Kunta's life on the plantation illustrates the multifaceted nature of resistance. It was not solely physical, nor solely mental. It was a combination of strategies, memories and deliberate choices that allowed him to maintain a sense of self in an environment designed to obliterate it. The preservation of identity required constant vigilance, discipline, and courage. Each act of survival, each small rebellion, each memory retained, contributed to an unbroken chain connecting him to home, family and ancestry. Through all the trials, labor, punishment, surveillance and social pressures, Kunta Kinte remained steadfast in his identity. His endurance demonstrates the power of human spirit to withstand systemic cruelty and the capacity of memory, culture and community to provide sustenance where physical resources are scarce. Kunta's story is a testament to resilience, illustrating that even under the most oppressive conditions, the mind and spirit can remain free, and that the preservation of self is an act of profound courage and defiance. The life of Kunta Kinte highlights the intersection of endurance, identity and resistance in the context of slavery. Every day was a test of will, every interaction a negotiation between survival and self-preservation, and every act of defiance, however subtle, was a statement of humanity. His story reflects not only the brutality of the system that sought to destroy him, but also the extraordinary capacity of individuals to maintain dignity, memory and identity against overwhelming odds. It is a narrative that underscores the unyielding human desire for freedom, the power of cultural and familial bonds, and the enduring legacy of resilience, even in the face of dehumanizing oppression. Kunta Kinte's story does not end with chains, whippings or failed escape attempt. His life stands as a powerful testament to the unbreakable human spirit, a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, identity, culture and dignity cannot be fully extinguished. Every scar on his body, every act of defiance, every memory of Joffre carried within him was proof that slavery could imprison a body but never the soul. His refusal to accept the name Toby, his preservation of Mandinka tradition, his relentless hope for freedom, all of these became symbols of resistance that transcended his own life, inspiring generations after him. The legacy of Kunta Kinte lies not only in his personal endurance, but in what he represents: the courage to resist erasure, the power of memory, and the strength to maintain one's humanity against forces designed to strip it away. Through his eyes we see the enormity of the suffering inflicted by slavery, but also the extraordinary resilience that allowed millions of enslaved Africans to survive and ultimately shape history. His story challenges us to remember the past honestly,
to honor those who suffered and resisted, and to recognize that freedom is both a birthright and a hard-fought achievement. Kunta Kinte's life reminds us that oppression can never fully silence the human spirit. Each act of resistance, no matter how small, carries meaning and significance. The whispers of African songs, the memories of home, the courage to preserve one's name and identity. These are victories that no master could take away. His story is a beacon, illuminating the enduring truth that strength, dignity, and hope are not determined by circumstance, but by the choices one makes in the face of adversity. Ultimately, Kunta Kinte is more than a historical figure. He is a symbol of resilience and defiance, a living embodiment of the power of identity to withstand the darkest forces. His life calls on us to honor the struggles of those who came before, to acknowledge the atrocities endured, and to celebrate the triumph of spirit over oppression. The legacy he left is eternal, a reminder that humanity, courage, and the unyielding pursuit of freedom can never be chained, and that the truth of his story and the countless others like it will continue to inspire, educate, and empower generations to come.